family, and welcome to this episode of Legacy Chat. My name is Rick, and I'm an alcoholic. I was given the gift of sobriety on November 17th, 1987, and it's my privilege to be your host for this episode. Legacy Chat is a podcast made by and for members of AA to share their experience, strength, and hope on all three of our legacies in Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's a service of takethe12.org. That's takethe12.org, a three-legacy study website. All episodes of this podcast will be available to listen to or download completely free on takethe12.org. The primary purpose of our time together is to create a discussion space of our three legacies so our listeners might be able to have a richer and more personal experience of AA's 12 steps, 12 traditions, and 12 concepts for world service. Legacy Chat is not affiliated with Alcoholics Anonymous, and neither myself nor any of my guests in this podcast speak for AA as a whole. We're only here today to share our own unique experience on one of AA's three legacies. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about step 10 in our first legacy of recovery, and I am just really excited to have as my special guest with us today a woman who has certainly for the last 5 years of my recovery played a pivotal role in both recovery, unity, and service in all three of our legacies. I met her through service opportunities here in our area, and she has just been an absolute gift in my life. So I'm really grateful to have Jenny L. with us today. Jenny, please introduce yourself. Tell our listeners where you're from, your home group, your sobriety date, and a little bit about how you got to AA.
Thanks, Rick. So, hey, y'all, I'm Jenny L., and I am an alcoholic, and I've been kept sober by the grace of God since May 31st, 2007. And my home group is the Chicago group, and we meet on Wednesday nights in Dallas, Texas. And so I'm from Dallas, born and raised here. And how I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, well, I drank a lot. Yeah, just a little bit.
And I've heard your stories, so I know that's true.
But more specifically, I guess I came in from a nudge from the judge. So my drinking led me to a super low bottom and lots of consequences. I got myself in a little bit of trouble, and was actually in the Dallas County Judicial Treatment Center. So grateful to the people of the CPC committees who talked to the judges about AA. And so I went part of my sentencing when I got out of treatment, in addition to probation, was to attend meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, which I did not want to do. And while I was in that treatment center, women from AA came and they carried this message, a message of depth and weight. And, so I started learning about alcoholism, as the book talks about, and learning about the allergy and the obsession and all of that. And then, wasn't enough for that step one experience. But when I got out of treatment and decided I needed to experiment a little more, eventually I did have that full-on step one, complete and utter surrender. And, that seed had been planted in my mind, in addition to, having to go to AA for, probation. And so I started going to Alcoholics Anonymous, and where I got a sponsor. And like I say, she got me into the book, into service, into the steps, and into the car.
And into the car, absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Jenny, and welcome. I'm really glad to have you here. So let's jump right into it. I'd like to read a couple of things before we jump into our conversation. And I particularly when we're doing a step episode, I always like to read from the foreword of the 12 and 12, and it says this: AA's 12 steps are a group of principles, spiritual in their nature, which, if practiced as a way of life, can expel the obsession to drink and enable the sufferer to become happily and usefully whole. And one of the reasons that I love reading that anytime I do any kind of presentation that is connected to the steps, is because I think it is probably one of the most beautiful single sentences ever written about to describe what our 12 steps are. You know, a group of principles, spiritual principles, right? Which, if practiced as a way of life, not just when it's convenient, not just every now and then, not just here and there, but practiced as a way of life, it can do several things for us. Expel the obsession to drink, enable the sufferer to become happily whole, and enable the sufferer to become usefully whole. And I love the two distinctions on those last two, because the happily whole that's internal. That's something that's going to happen in me, in addition to the obsession being removed. But the external part was what I didn't know I was going to get when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, that usefully whole thing, that being of service, maximum service to God and those about us. So we're going to be talking about step 10 today. And I want to read the actual step. And it goes like this: continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. And I always like to highlight the spiritual principle of each of our 36 legacies. And for me, at least, the spiritual principle that I like to use for step 10 is perseverance, the spiritual concept of constantly being willing to put one foot in front of the other. And I also, when I'm taking someone through the steps, like to synthesize it down, in addition to using the literature, synthesize it down to what is that one thing that you need to know about this step. And in this case, I have chosen the one thing that I make sure that my sponsees know about is that in step 10, as we are learning about this ongoing inventory process, there's a beautiful part of this chapter that teaches us exactly what a sober day looks like, what we will get if we continue to do this work. So when I asked you to be a guest on this podcast, and you said that you would be willing to speak on step 10, why did you say yes to this specific step?
Wow. Why did I say yes? Well, I guess because I look at, steps 10, 11, and 12 as the growth steps. Many people say they're the maintenance steps. And, if we're not growing, we're going. And what I have learned in practicing continuously with perseverance, step 10, is that this is where, I get to gain emotional stability, where I get to continue to grow up in here. And and really step 10 is, 4 through 9 wrapped up in a nice little package all day long, every single day, where it says continue for a lifetime.
Right.
And so I said yes to being, to do step 10, because it's where I find a lot of growth. I got the opportunity I get the opportunity to practice step 10 a lot, but, last week, even with something and getting to realize where I said something I shouldn't have said, and hey, let me look at this, and practicing step 10, and then getting to make amends to that person and the growth that comes from that.
Yeah, and I think that I absolutely think that for those of us who have taken the steps, when we took step 4 and wrote out our personal inventory, let another person listen to it in 5, became entirely ready to have all of the defects that were identified in that inventory in 6 to let them go, to surrender them. In 7, asked God to remove them. In 8 and 9, began to clean up the mess that we made through the amends that we get to make through the amends process. When we do all of that, it doesn't mean, and our book even says, we're not washed white as snow, right? And because my sponsor, actually, he hasn't said this, but this is what I've heard him say is if I'm breathing, I'm defecting. Or if I'm breathing, I have the opportunity for a defect to manifest, right? Because I'm human. And so even though I did this beautiful inventory in 4 and became entirely ready to have that stuff removed in 6 and ask God to remove it in 7, it doesn't mean that I'm going to be washed white as snow. And those defects are going to come back. Why? Because I'm human, right? So 10 helps us with that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, my ego has taken a big beating lately where I feel like my higher power is definitely pruning me. And I've been
Right.
in a bit of a wilderness spot, which is something new and different, but I'm recognizing it as far as just where my ego is rearing its ugly head, like all these defects, like wanting to latch on to all this outside stuff to feel like it's making me feel whole and good enough, which is always one of the things that pops up, in the fears when I do a 4th column
Right.
in an inventory. And we're trying to grow in here. And they talk about that linkage between self-examination and then of course, prayer and meditation in step 11. But, I can't go to God and ask for these defects to be removed unless I don't see them. And sadly, or happily, I don't know. I'm big into badly wrapped gifts. Not necessarily in the moment, but that's been my experience. Is that really, unfortunately, pain is the touchstone of all spiritual growth, and usually it's because I've harmed someone, and I've made a fool out of myself, or been a jerk.
Well, because I'm not smart enough. And I know you gave your sobriety date at the beginning during the introduction, but you have how many years right now?
Like 14 and a half.
14 and a half. And so and the reason that I bring that up is because I know that, I've got 34, and there are times whenever I'm at the podium sharing my experience, strength, and hope, or even in a meeting, and I'll share how my defects have manifested at that time. And inevitably, or recently, and inevitably some newcomer will come up to me and say, "Oh my God, you're 34 years sober. Why are you still dealing with defects?" Right? And I'm like, because I'm a drunk and because I'm human, right? And so I think it's important, and I'm grateful that you shared that you've been kind of in a little bit of a wilderness lately, because it is important that people with some time underneath their belts share that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's been crazy just because like people aren't asking me to sponsor them, so I was always used to that, and so my ego's suffering. Like women are choosing to go to another sponsor, which great, at least they're not leaving the program, and I want that for them, but my ego's like, ah! And what else? Rotating out of some service positions that did a lot for that. And I understand then the power or the importance of the principle of rotation. But again, like I'm saying, my ego just, it's horrible.
Right.
And, so I said some nasty, I said something that was not really nasty. It just was a little harsh and uncalled for to someone I love very much, where we had a bit of a change in a relationship, and it's just been sad for me.
Right.
And so at this opportunity of being almost 15, I'm realizing, okay, well, when I was new, I didn't want someone with 15, 20 years to sponsor me either.
Right.
And maybe kind of going into a different role at where I'm at in my sobriety. But what else it is that I'm getting to really see this and be pruned of a lot of things that, like I said earlier, maybe the delusion of thinking these things make me okay. And I'm really getting on my knees more and going to trust. and rely on God.
And as you said earlier, pain is the touchstone to all spiritual growth, right? Now, it doesn't have to be, but for people like you and I, it oftentimes is. And how beautiful is it? How beautiful is it that the very first word of step 10 is continued?
Mhm.
That's the direction right there. I don't, I need to be reminded on a regular basis that this isn't a one and done.
Yeah.
Right. And so through the action of continuing to take a look at all of the causes and conditions of our failure, or of my failure, that I get to continue to do the work. Right. Going back to the spiritual principle of perseverance. One of the things that I have loved being able to do in my own recovery and when I'm working with sponsees is to have them be vitally aware, or that's not the right word, aware. We'll just say aware of how I can practically apply the spiritual principle of this step in my life today, not just in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. So I want to talk for a moment about this idea of perseverance. Whether it be in your personal life, with friends, with family, I know you're married, so with your husband, with your stepchildren, at your job, with friends again, or even inside the rooms of AA with God and AA. How has perseverance shown up in your life today, either as something that came easy for you or something you struggled with?
Well, so, I was taught from the beginning about the principle of consistency. So again, perseverance, like not giving up. And the book itself, on page 84 says continue 4 times. We continue to take personal inventory, continue to set right any new mistakes as we go along. And then, it should continue for our lifetime and then continue again. And, what I have found is, again, like we've touched on, I'm human. I'm going to make these mistakes. Like, it's like whack-a-mole with all these defects, and the book, gives us a great formula for, what to do. And I look at step 10 as this all day long walking around step. And so hopefully I'll get to answer the actual question, but a woman from my old home group called this the 4x4. And it was a great way for me to remember it because it's on page 84. And, it says, so what we do is we continue to watch. So action, we're watching for this stuff, which implies to me that it's going to happen. But we watch for selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. 4 things that we're always looking for. And then we do these 4 other things. It says when, not if, these crop up, we ask God at once to remove them. 2, we discuss them with someone immediately. 3, we make amends quickly if we've harmed anyone. And then the 4th thing, then we resolutely turn our thoughts to someone we can help. And so you watch for those 4 things, and then you have those 4 things to do. And so what I have found is that, it says our next function is to grow in understanding and effectiveness, and that we have to be at the place where we're fit ourselves to be a maximum service, and then be at the place where we can be of maximum service. And I'm not doing that, or cannot, and am unable to do that if I'm not present in the moment, because I'm all stewing in my stuff. If I'm disturbed about some sort of resentment, or if I'm acting out in selfishness and, dishonesty, resentment, fear.
Right.
And so persevering through this step, or, practicing this step all day long, every day, watching for these things and then taking those actions allows me to certainly, realize where my defects of character harm others, where I can get down to causes and conditions, where I can go to God and ask, him to remove them, where I can, be better, more effective. I shouldn't say better, but more effective with the relationships I have. And sometimes I'm better than others.
And I would, and
You
that's,
know?
I'm so glad you said that, because that's where I was going to go next was, what are your biggest obstacles in taking this step, and, or what do you have to surrender in your life when you take this step? You kind of alluded to it when you read from the book, it very specific, gives us very clear-cut direction, right? But what are your biggest obstacles in this?
Saying I was wrong to my husband.
There you go.
My
Cheers.
definition of promptly is a little bit elastic when it comes to Jenny's husband versus say like, well, okay. And so you mentioned how I practice it at work. Well, currently right now I am in the middle of I actually start a new part-time job tomorrow, but I've been unemployed for a while. And then of course, with the past 2 years, there really wasn't any interaction hardly with people at work. But back at my old agency, I butted heads with people a lot. And, and it was like, there was one woman in particular who just, I don't know, we just kind of clashed. And I got to practice this with her a lot. So probably my husband and people, sponsees and or with people at my home group in AA
Right.
is, where I get to practice it the most.
I loved how
lately.
I loved how you said earlier, and I'm probably going to misquote this, but you said this, you call this your walk through your day step?
Like all day long walking around step.
All day long walking around step. I love that. I've never heard anyone say that before. And what a great, simple way to say, or to just kind of grab onto, how do I use this?
Well, I got that from Debbie D. I think
all
she
right.
did a really great talk at a women's conference a few years ago on 10 and 11, and to differentiate, because there's that whole thing about how people think step 10 is the nightly inventory,
Right?
And Bill messed it up in the 12 and 12, and it's a little confusing with all these inventories we get to do,
Right.
and like they kind of. So Debbie had said that honestly, that step 10 was the all day long walking around step. And then the nightly inventory within step 11 is the kind of catch all if you miss it at night. And I get to practice both.
Well, and you don't know this, but you just answered my next question, which was, if any, do you think there are any myths about this step? I mean, what are some of the things we hear in AA meetings about this step that in your experience just aren't true? And you just gave us what I was hoping you would give us as an answer for step 10, which is the nightly inventory step when we retire at night. Because I've had so many people, especially early on in recovery, like I would have sponsors that would say, all right, so call me and do a 10th step. Well, all right, but just so we know, that's not the when we retire at night, right? Because that's actually in step 11. So what are some of the myths that you've heard, other than maybe that, about this step that simply are not true?
Probably just that one.
Right.
Really. And I have a lot of people going like, I'm supposed to call, when this happens. And I'm like, yeah. And I get, so really, I mean, that's it. Cause most people say, the 10th step at night, and it's very clear that, what the big book says, but then that 12 and 12, where, it does talk about that spot check inventory, which is on the spot all day long, walking around when these crop up, but then doing one, annually or whatever for like a spring cleaning. Why not? Or, just whatever. I'll have to go to the book and look in the 12 and 12. I'm not as well versed in it. annual or semi-annual, the occasional retreat from the outside world.
Right.
But he says it, there's the one we take at day's end when we review the happenings of the hours just past. That's on page 89 and 12 and 12 in step 10. And that, well, it contradicts the big book.
Shh, hold on, don't say that out loud.
I'm just reading the black print.
I'm reading actually the words on the page. No, you're absolutely right. And to a newcomer, that might be confusing, which is one of the reasons that we really, really need to have someone who's already walked through this handhold us and walk us through it, which actually is the perfect lead into my next kind of thing I wanted to talk about, which was when teaching a sponsee how to take this step, is there one specific thing you always want them to know about this step?
Just do it.
Just do it.
And
right.
I can, I speak from experience because I didn't really practice it for a long time. And then, I heard, it was Katie P, and she did a talk on it, and it just blew my mind. And so, I started really practicing step 10 because, hey, come on, you know what? We are in a 12-step program, and I, have been guilty at times of maybe practicing, I don't know, 3.5, 10, 5, like
some of the steps.
Right. And so, here's the deal. It says, we're given clear-cut instructions on how to have this daily reprieve, which is a delay of death sentence. I thought reprieve meant a little vacay, but it means a stay of execution. We have this death sentence, and we're given these clear, this program of action and a way of living which can enable the user to become happily and usefully whole, and expel the obsession to drink, and and so there's these actions. And so at some point I was like, I have this responsibility to practice all of this, and I'm not necessarily doing that. And what I have found in continuing to do a 10th step, because I don't know if I actually say practice as much for this step. It's like, hey, I'm feeling resentful. Do you have time to chat? Yeah. And then I go through this quick inventory that at times, sometimes it's like I've left it on someone's voicemail because that was the instructions, where I go through the 4 columns, or I write it down on a little piece of paper, with just, I'm resentful at, why, the columns, and that it helps me. It helps me stay in the sunlight of the spirit. It helps me stay in the now. It helps me be able to be effective in whatever I'm faced with for that day. Sure. Because when I'm in resentment and fear and all this stuff, the book talks about squandering the hours. Claudia has described it as a resentment blackout. So if I'm like, oh, I'm so mad at blah, 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 and I'm driving down the road and I don't even remember how I got home, I've seen nothing because I've got these blinders on. Like, if I'm stewing in my head, I can't be effective with what I'm going to do next.
And the only way that we can, at least it's been my experience, the only way that we can begin to do the work on that is if I'm alert, awake, and aware to the fact that that's happening in the moment.
Yeah.
If I am not present to the moment, to the day as it's happening, there's no way I can do that inventory, even become aware that I'm in a resentment blackout. I love that phrase. I also want to, little side note, not that it has anything to do with step 10, but you mentioned Katie P a moment ago. I had the opportunity to listen to Katie do a Saturday morning 8 a.m. workshop at a conference in New York City years ago on the 4-step. And I thought, who wants to get up and go to a 8 a.m. workshop on the 4-step? But I am so grateful I did, because as you said, Katie has a very profound way of unpacking our steps in ways that can change you. And so I'm really glad that you mentioned that. I want to talk for a second about we have throughout our literature a host of promises. I was a part of a home group when I was living in New York years ago. That was the name of the group was the PPAW group, Promises, Prayers, Actions, and Warnings Group of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it was a big book study, a closed big book study. And our goal was to go through the first 164 pages and to identify, highlight, underline, big black marker or whatever, all of the promises, all of the prayers, all of the actions, and all of the warnings. And one of the things that I learned through that process was that there are a ton of promises throughout our literature, and we have some that are called out on a regular basis, like the ninth step promises, right? But we forget, or we are not shown clearly, or it's not talked about, like the second step promises and the fifth step promises, and our 10th step has a set of promises as well, right? And one of the things that my sponsors in my life, I've had multiple, have encouraged me to do, and I do with my sponsees, is to read our literature in first person. And the 10th step promises or promise is a really great place to do this. And so if you don't mind, I'm going to take a moment and I'm going to read the promise that's in our 10th step, but I'm going to read it in first person because I really want our listeners to to see that there is an opportunity for an experience different than the way it's written on the page. And it says this: I've ceased fighting anything or anyone, even my insane thinking. For today, soundness of mind or sanity has returned. I will seldom be interested in, now the book says alcohol, but I like to read it as participating in my negative thinking or my insanity. I react soundly or sanely and normally, and I find that this has happened automatically. I see that my new attitude toward the noise that lives between my left ear and my right ear, even though the book says alcohol, has been given me without any thought or effort on my part. It just comes. That's the miracle of it. I'm not fighting it. Neither am I avoiding temptation. I feel as though I've been placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. I've not even sworn off. Instead, the negative thinking or insanity has been removed. It doesn't exist for me. I'm neither cocky nor am I afraid. That's my experience. That's how I react, so long as I keep in fit spiritual condition. Now, when I read that to a sponsee in that way, I always followed up with this disclaimer. The purpose of me reading that paragraph in our book in the way that I read it is not in the least to try and rewrite our literature. It was modified for this step study that I run my sponsees through so that we can begin to have a truly personal experience with it in ways that shed light on the real nature of our problem, the spiritual malady, right? Step 1 is the only step that talks about alcohol. Steps 2 through 12 talk about how we can become recovered from a hopeless state of mind and body. And this step reminds us that we have a daily reprieve, or the definition of that, a reprieve is a temporary suspension from our insanity, so long as we continue our personal inventory, immediately admit our wrongs, and remember throughout our day that somewhere along the line, we took step 2 and came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to soundness of mind. When I read that promise that way, what resonates with you, or what comes up for you?
Well, absolutely. Like, the thinking is really my problem.
That's
and
right.
that's just, I mean, it's so apparent about, I'll just share the experience. It was like 2 weeks ago at my home group, and there's a woman there who I got to sponsor, and we got really close, and I love her dearly. And some stuff happened, won't get into it, and then it was bad as far as some situational stuff, blah blah blah. And she switched sponsors, and I mean, it just hurt. And our relationship, was it's changed, and it's been a challenge. and I'm feeling hurt. I'm human. And it's like we've talked and everything's cool. And like I want her to get what she needs, and she is, and she's growing and it's great, but it's that kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, the angel and devil on the shoulder, and it's like that ego that's like, like, who am I if I'm not sponsoring her? So anyway, she just asked me if I was going to dinner after the meeting. And historically at my group, we go to dinner, but the women don't participate very much. And so what I said to her was, yes, I always go. Like, don't you know who I am? I always go. And what was not said, but I guess was implied in this harsh comment that was completely unnecessary, was, y'all don't do it right. Where are all the women? All this stuff. And really, it's not about what they do, it's about what I do.
Right.
And so in that moment, and what she was just trying to do is be excited to get to see me, and I should not have said that comment. And so of course later, and this is perhaps where in the moment with a step 10 of watching for that and that fear and resentment, that it was all of that. And saying, hey, that was wrong. That was uncalled for. More prompt. I did not do that. So I caught it later. And, that nightly inventory, I was like, wow, I really need to clean that up. And so, so I reached out to her, and she had a schedule situation, so I wasn't able to talk to her for a couple of days. And, I got to make that right and talk about how I was wrong. And then I shared with authenticity, because we're friends, like, this is what's going on with me.
Right.
And then the following week, we went to dinner. So last week, and, we got to sit next to each other. And because of practicing that, where I, with humility, getting to admit where I was wrong and try to, take the action to make that right. And just really say, hey, I'm sorry, And so anyway, it's all good. And it's like, we really turned a corner, but my stuff in this moment of these past few months of whatever's going on with me. And of course I probably had to go through all of it and blah, 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 but now it's finally been healed, and that's the beauty of it.
And once again, you answered a question before I asked it. How beautiful is God, right?
Okay,
the next question that I was going to ask was, what were some of the ways in which you were able to find peace and comfort applying this step in your life?
well, in that, because I don't know if it's necessarily peace and comfort in the moment. Like, when I get to run, well, do a 10 step with someone, where I get people with whom I have spiritual consent. And so I can say, hey, like, I've got people, not just my sponsor, because if she's not available, like, I need to be present. I need to be effective. So if I'm, supposed to say, like, there was a situation some years ago where I was supposed to drive out to Tarrant County wide with some sponsees and get a car full of people. And one of the women was like driving me nuts. And it's like, I needed to get that out and clean that up right away. So I could not be resentful in the car with this girl driving an hour to that event.
Right.
And so anyway, I have these people with whom I have spiritual consent. And in the moment, yeah, sometimes it's not peaceful and comforting, but I get to know where my self-righteousness shows up and all the stuff. And, and then I'm like, wow. And to see these patterns and to recognize, God, my ego, what's going on?
Right.
And then get down to, well, like last night I went to this birthday night and nobody thanked me. And this one woman had two years sober, and she got my number. And like, it's crazy how she got my number. She called me. I was at work at an actual office at the time, and so I couldn't talk. She was drunk when she called me. I almost didn't answer the phone, but I did. And then I was like, can you get to this meeting later? Because I didn't have time to talk. And so she got there. She was drunk. And then 4 days later, I had a party. She showed up. She's 4 days sober, 50 women, you know, women, we don't like women. You may have heard this. We like them now, but in the beginning, and it's terrifying to go to an event. Anyway, she came to this party, and you know, long story short, she ended up meeting her sponsor, and you know, blah blah blah, and she's still sober. And I was at that birthday night, and she didn't thank me. And I'm in this moment, and there were some other people too, blah blah blah. And so I'm like, wow. And it really is like God's working on my humility lately and my ego. But to recognize that is absolutely not, none of that is practicing the spiritual foundation of all our traditions. None of it's about that anonymity.
That's right.
And it's, so I'm like, what's going on with me that my ego is struggling?
That's right.
And it's just the fear of not good enough. It's always that one.
And what do I,
And
and
God's
what,
not enough.
and that God's not enough. What do I get to learn today? What lessons am I here to learn today? And not playing the victim role, right? Instead of why is life happening to me, I get to ask the question, why is life happening for me?
Yeah.
What am I here to learn today? I want to unpack something you said a moment ago. You talked about calling someone and reading a fifth step or a 10th step. And that sometimes it's not always, your sponsor's not available. And what made me think of wanting to kind of circle back on this is I remember a time where one night I got a phone call from you, and you needed to do a 10 step, and your sponsor wasn't available. And so you asked me if I'd be willing to listen to it, and I did. And so I just want to put an exclamation mark on the idea that when we're continuing this process of looking at ourselves and our defects of character, it doesn't just have to be with our sponsor.
Yeah. I mean, it's some people, you know, like I was talking to a friend lately, and she couldn't get a hold of her sponsor, and her sponsor was just got a lot going on, personal life, work, all that stuff. And so, you know, she was talking to me, and then she did end up getting to speak to her sponsor, and her sponsor really wants her to call her only. Have not really ever been given that direction. And I guess it's just because truly a sponsor is a human power. And, you know, I mean, obviously they're human, they're going to have lives and can't be available. And in the moment, like, I need to be able to take the action to get undisturbed, because again, it's about me being effective.
Right.
And I cannot be effective if I'm stewing. And so the 10 step that it looks different. And so here, I'll explain it. There was a particular time where I was a woman that I used to sponsor had started texting me at 6 a.m, trying to get me to do some work for her. And, you know, and I didn't want to do this work for her. You know, she didn't hire me in the first place. And then she threw in this tit for tat thing of, remember when my mom came over and consulted on some interior design work, so therefore you owe me this. And, you know, so I was mad she was keeping score. And then, you know, it affected all these things, you know, my self-esteem, because, you know, says I'm talented, I'm worthy of hire, you know, then personal relationships, like no friend should keep score like that, pride. Just, I don't need to go into the whole deal. And then, you know, but it really affected all the stuff in the third column. And I was on my way to work that morning. And I'm like in the car stewing. And so what I did is I pulled over and I jotted down the quick little inventory going through the columns. And I called my sponsor at the time, and she wasn't available. So then I called Katie, who is one of those ones that has been given me the instruction that if, you know, we call and process a 10th step, she's like, just leave it on my voicemail. And then her instructions are, don't talk about it with anybody else, because I'll want to, I want a team build, like get people on my side. That's what Jennifer HK says. Team building. So Katie's like, just leave it on my voicemail and that's it. And I've actually found that even doing that and waiting till Katie can call back, which might be days,
Right.
that it helps me get out of that stewing. This particular time I had said, hey, to my sponsor, like, I need to talk to you. So she did call back shortly afterwards, and I was able to process it with her in that moment. And in processing that with her, you know, I was able to get down to some causes and conditions. But additionally, I didn't need the sponsor or Katie, this particular one, because God could get in there and work.
That's
and
right.
When I did the fourth column, what I got to see was the fear, my delusion around some stuff, the dishonesty. You know, I have a self-seeking was question mark,
Mhm.
but probably, you know, seeking the self of how I want her to think about me and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, my selfishness and everything. And what I had discovered in this moment was the reason, you know, I realized why she was trying to get a better deal on what she wanted to hire me to do.
Right.
And that her husband had left her with a huge mortgage and a child. And
Right.
she was just in fear trying to get what she needed. And honestly, I had sponsored her. So we'll just use that term with air quotes. And so it was delusional of me to think that she would be any different, because she really didn't have to go down.
Well, and I want to actually also clarify something. You have referred multiple times throughout this episode about the fourth column and the columns. Those columns that you're referring to, in case there's anyone listening who is new, the columns you're referring to are actually in the fourth step inventory, but the content in those columns is absolutely applicable in our 10th step as we're going back and doing that ongoing inventory. So I just wanted to kind of level that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because it's a mini inventory every day.
That's right.
And so looking at that stuff and with that particular situation, when I realized with, you know, that woman and then then a song came on the radio, honestly, about forgiveness.
Right on.
So yay, God.
I was gonna say, God doing for you what you couldn't do for yourself.
You know, it was, it was the song, and so it was like, oh. And so then, of course, I got to talk to my sponsor for this particular one. And then Katie called back and talked about how I have these deep spiritual pockets. Right. And my ego didn't want to do this job for her. You know, she should have hired me in the first place and blah, blah, blah. And then Katie was like, well, could you just you know, do it?
Right. Exactly.
Yes. You know, the spiritual life's not a theory, we have to live it. And I was like, yes. And then it was so funny, and I'll wrap this little story up. But, you know, I mean, Katie talks about taking the high road. And then there's a high road above that, and then even a high road above that. What? Right. And sometimes that can be hard, but you know, I want to continue to grow. I want to be the woman that God has made me to be, and you know, continue to be able to help others. Right. And be effective. And so I remember a few days after this little sitch happened, you know, and Katie had illuminated how I was self-righteous and blah, blah, blah. But this woman called me, and I remember I was on the Texpress lanes, was driving home. I just completely remember this. And she called, and my knee-jerk reaction is, don't answer the phone. She's dead to me. And then I'm like, wait a second. Like, I've done something different, you know, like I agreed that I could take the high road and that I would be willing to do this job. And so I answered the phone, and she had called me because she had seen that, you know, my niece had just been born. You know, she'd seen it on Facebook back when I was on Facebook. And she was calling to wish me congratulations, because she also was an aunt and said that that was the best job in the world. And my experience so far has been that, yes, that's true. But because of the 10th step and because of doing that, I was able to pick up the phone and take the high road and do something different. And, and then say, hey, I'm willing to do that job. And she had found somebody else. So even just me being willing, God worked it out and I didn't have to do that. Because honestly, I'm not really good at what she was asking me to do anyway. But I was willing.
And honestly, Jen, that story elevates and displays the perfect description of what Bill talks about on page 567 of our book, The Personality Change Sufficient to Bring About Recovery from Alcoholism. You wanted to become a different woman, and so you took different actions, right? But we can't do that unless we are willing to do the ongoing inventory, which you clearly did in that moment. We're about out of time. Is there anything that you would like to offer as a closing comment on step 10? Anything you want our listeners to remember as they begin to put the spiritual principle into practical application in their lives?
Just that we're not going to do it perfectly. But so one of the things that I guess I talk about is, where it says what we have on 85, it says what we really have is that daily reprieve contingent on the maintenance of our spiritual condition.
That's right.
And so, some days are better than others. And the way that I look at it, and it seems silly, but hey, it works, is, that we have to do it, obviously, but the maintenance of it, where okay, so if you want to maintain a home or a car or whatever, I look at, maintaining my personal hygiene or what. So, there's some days that I'm running late and I just get out the door and, I'm going to brush my teeth. I'm going to throw my hair in a ponytail and throw on some, leggings and a shirt. And let's get real, I always wear my eye makeup, but, so that's like the bare minimum. And then, other days it's like the whole 9 yards where I'm going to get all glammed up to go to some fancy, wedding or something. And I'm shaving my legs and went and got my hair blown out and highlighted. And actually I'm wearing, foundation on my face, all the makeup. And, I apologize if that's not a great analogy for everybody, but it works for me. And just that I'm maintaining it. I'm doing something no matter what. And some days I'm, get to spend a lot more time, in the morning connecting to God. Some days I'm going to miss a 10 step in that moment. I'm going to clean it up later. My definition of promptly has gotten better over the years.
Right.
Some days with Greg, it's not.
And yeah, exactly. All we have to do is ask your husband, right? I absolutely love that as a closing comment, because what it does for me, Jen, is it reminds me that every single one of our promises in our program are conditional. I get this if I do this, or if I want this, I must do this. Yeah. And so I'm just so, and I'm very, very grateful that you shared that. Jen, thank you so much for your time and for your service. I'm confident that our listeners are going to be able to take away a lot about Step 10 through your sharing. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much for asking me and for the opportunity and for your service.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome.
And I love AA.
And so do I. So do I.
It's amazing, it really is like what you said. It's like it's a way of living that expels the obsession to drink and allows the sufferer to become happily and usefully whole. And I was not that. And
I didn't want that coming in, or I didn't think I was going to get that, right?
And, there's just so much.
I love it. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Just a reminder to everyone that you can go to takethe12.org to learn more about all three of our legacies in AA through STEP, tradition, and concept studies, blog posts, videos, books, and so much more. Until next time, let us not forget Bill W.'s words when he said this: "We clearly see AA in three dimensions: the dimension of recovery, the dimension of unity, and the dimension of service. Without any one of these, AA couldn't function." God bless.